say on the Republican side.
Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I will now use my time to make an opening statement, and then I'll turn it over to the ranking member. Before I go into the details of this particular hearing, I want to publicly comment on the good work and relationship that the chair has had with the ranking member, Mr. Keating from Massachusetts. We both are former prosecutors, and he brings a good tone to this committee and the full committee as well, and I want to thank him for the easy way it's been for us to work together while I have been chair of this committee. We don't always agree, but we get along quite well. I think our subcommittee especially, and the Foreign Affairs Committee, do an excellent job of bipartisan work. You never hear about it because we're not fussing and fighting and feuding, and so I want to thank him publicly for his role in the last several years on this subcommittee. And I don't know what the future holds, but you may be chair of this committee or another one come January the 2nd. But thank you very much for the bipartisanship, a relationship that we both have had together. The threat of terrorism remains a deadly challenge for us and our allies around the globe. In the last 4 years, we have seen the ability of terrorist groups, many of which we had thought were defeated, to evolve and attract thousands and recruit others for their violent cause. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Iran, and all their affiliates and their proxies are very active and waiting in the shadows for an opportunity to strike again. Although we have made much progress against these terrorists on battlefields of Iraq, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, the gains are fragile. Last week, a report by the Pentagon warned that ISIS fighters have moved underground and are regrouping. Many of those terrorists that were in the Middle East have been run out of the Middle East and have fled to Africa and are regrouping and causing mischief there. We must not become complacent. We must continue to be vigilant until those that motivate violent extremism are cast into the dustbin of history. I applaud the White House's new national strategy for counterterrorism. The document drastically changed the U.S. government's perspective on the war on terrorism. It correctly frames the battle in terms of an enduring challenge that must be managed to protect the homeland instead of a mission that has a beginning and an end. It clearly recognizes the broad and diverse challenges we face from terrorism, including Iran's growing network of terrorist proxies and the ability of terrorists to exploit cyberspace. The strategy prioritizes countering terrorist use of the Internet for radicalization, recruitment, and fundraising. Three things that I have long made clear. That is why they use the Internet. Many times they use our own platforms to radicalize, to recruit, and to fundraise. This is a priority I introduced into the State Authorities Bill last Congress, and I'm glad to see the White House has taken this seriously. The strategy also makes it clear that this fight is not America's burden alone. International partners play an important role, and we can empower them by bolstering their capabilities and increasing cooperation. After all, we are all in this together. That's where the State Department's Counterterrorism Bureau comes in. Created in '72 in response to the Munich Olympics attack, the Bureau forges partnerships with foreign governments, multilateral organizations, and NGOs to coordinate and advance U.S. counterterrorism objectives that enhance global security as well as our own. Under that broad mission, it has several core responsibilities, including coordinating strategy across the United States, or rather the State Department and other agencies, conducting counterterrorism diplomacy, building capacity of partner nations to address terrorist threats within their own. Given the enduring threat from terrorism that we and our allies face, it's crucial that the CT Bureau does its job effectively and efficiently. It's our job in Congress to make sure that the American taxpayers are getting their money's worth. When we're talking about millions of dollars going toward programs abroad, the people in my district are right to demand how it contributes to their personal safety and security and the security of our nation. This is all the more important given that the Bureau has been significantly had funding cuts over recent years. With limited resources, every penny must be spent wisely. Example, State Department's Inspector General filed a report last year that found much of the anti-terrorism assistance we had been given to Pakistan was not even being used, including dozens of courses not implemented in Pakistan. I am pleased to hear that the Bureau has since repurposed many of the resources that had been sent to Pakistan to other more worthwhile programs. Effective monitoring and evaluation programs are crucial in spotting what is not working and making changes that do. For instance, we need assurances that the programming initiated and implemented by the CT Bureau to prevent radicalization, that it actually works. Is the Bureau still in the business of, quote, countering violent extremism? If so, has the Bureau developed any mechanisms to prove that such programs are working at all? Ambassador Sales, I appreciate your strong comments against Iranian-backed terrorism yesterday at the Washington Institute. As you know, I am eager to see our government to go a step further than just designating the IRGC for terrorist activity. If we mean business, we must go after Iran's terrorist proxies in Iraq and Syria. Iran is playing us because they use terrorist proxies instead of the IRGC to spread terrorism in the region. I do applaud the Treasury's designation yesterday of 4 Hezbollah-affiliated terrorists in Iraq. Now the State Department must follow suit and finally designate groups like AAH and HHN for what they are. They are foreign terrorist organizations that have blood of Americans on their hands. At the very least, their affiliation with the IRGC should be enough to meet the criteria to designate them. And Ambassador Sales, thank you for your important work and for being here today, and look forward to your testimony. And now I'll turn it over to the ranking member, Mr. Keating, from Massachusetts, for his opening comments.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And since this will be our last hearing, I just want to thank you for your work. I think it shows a great deal in Congress right now, where a conservative Republican from Texas joins with a progressive Democrat from Massachusetts, and
that's pretty bipartisan, isn't it?
That's about bipartisan. That's as much as it can get, but in a good way. And although many of these things might have been lost in the news cycle because we worked together so smoothly, it hasn't been lost internationally. I can think of our work together trying to bring support to a country that has great concerns over their head in Georgia, working together on that, working on the tariff issue, something that was noticed strongly, particularly by the European Union countries, where we made our bipartisan voice heard on our concern for some of those moves, as well as keeping Saudi Arabia's feet to the fire on issues and some of their promises. So we have worked together on those issues and many other issues together, and I'll miss working with you. You decided to go another way, and that's just the way it is. I can say that for the last time. And I'd like to thank you for holding this hearing with Ambassador Sales today. Returning again to the subcommittee to discuss the Bureau's budget and policy objectives. Look forward to your testimony today. And now that you're a full year into your duties in this role, fighting terrorism is also not solely the function of the military. That's not how it works in the United States fighting domestic terrorism, and it's not long-term strategy for how it can be worked successfully abroad in other countries. Capacity building for law enforcement, improving governance and rule of law to address systematic grievances in communities, it's critical. And we need to put the proper funding behind these and other efforts if we're going to have a counterterrorism strategy that's successful in the long term. I'm therefore concerned by the State Department's request for less funding overall, and specifically for anti-terrorism programs. I don't know how we can expect any gains made by our military to last if we don't back up their hard-fought efforts with robust work through our State Department and USAID engagements. What's more, terrorist capacities are evolving with increased concerns over cyber attacks or the use of weapons of mass destruction, like a chemical attack. We're still working tirelessly to make a lasting, significant dent in familiar terrorist threats, let alone the new ones. So a request for less funding to meet these new demands gives me pause, to say the least. I'm also saddened as threats for terrorism are actually getting worse in Afghanistan and as the conflict and humanitarian crisis in Yemen wears on at the expense of tens of thousands of lives lost and millions impacted, producing the perfect stage for extremism to take root for generations to come. Neither of these countries receives the attention in recent national counterterrorism strategies issued by the White House, nor do any of the regions where ISIS fighters have traveled to or where their so-called caliphates have emerged reach that level. You have an important job. Our government has struggled for a long time trying to get counterterrorism right, and the stakes are high. Americans are victims of foreign terrorists and of domestic terrorists, and we learn more and more every day about how many ways we can try to tackle this problem. There's no easy answer, but there are themes, and I look forward to discussing what your Bureau is doing along these lines. For example, what your Bureau is doing to coordinate with other State Department, USAID, and Defense Department entities to minimize fragility and instability in places where radicalism efforts may more easily take hold. These and many other issues I hope to cover today on our counterterrorism and CVE strategies. So I look forward to discussing with you whether and how these efforts to shape and effectively implement them are sufficiently resourced and coordinated at the State Department as part of the administration's whole-of-government approach to these issues. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. The chair will recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Snyder, for an opening statement.
Thank you, and I want to echo the remarks of my colleague to the chairman. I have appreciated working with you and wish you well in your next chapter. You'll be missed here greatly, but thank you for all you have done. Ambassador Sales, thank you for joining us. My focus, having reviewed your testimony, also reviewing your remarks yesterday at the Washington Institute. Terrorist threats are increasing around the world. They're increasing in geography and complexity. They're increasing in intensity. And yet the request from the administration appears to be drawing back, or at least reducing our investment in fighting against those threats. Very concerned about that and look forward to remarks there. I do appreciate your remarks yesterday about Iran. Iran is the #1 state sponsor of terror. They are a threat, not just in the region, around the world. Within the region, their support for Hezbollah, the fact that Hezbollah is increasingly strong, war-tested, developing indigenous missile manufacturing capability to threaten Israel and the region is of great concern. So my request is that we continue to stay focused, and I look forward to hearing your remarks about how we intend to fight against these threats. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Ambassador Nathan Sales is the coordinator for the counterterrorism at the State Department. Ambassador Sales was previously a law professor at Syracuse University of Law, and before that, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Department of Homeland Security. Ambassador Sales, we all have your written testimony, and if you can limit your testimony to 5 minutes, then we'll ask you questions. You're recognized. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Chairman Poe and Ranking Member Keating, for hosting this hearing today. It's a pleasure to be back before the subcommittee. Let me just say, Mr. Chairman, we'll miss you. I'll add the State Department's words of well wishes as you move on to the next chapter. Thank you for your service over the years, particularly on the problem of terrorism. And Mr. Ranking Member Keating, it's a pleasure to see you again. Look forward to working with you in the next Congress, in this committee, or in another capacity. Thanks for the opportunity to be here to talk to you about the work of the State Department's Counterterrorism Bureau and our ongoing efforts to protect the American people and our interests from the threat of terrorism at home and abroad. I'd like to start by highlighting a few of the key points in the administration's counterterrorism strategy, which we released on October 4th. This is the fourth strategy that the U.S. government has released since 9/11, and the first one since 2011. It reflects today's fluid, complex, and diverse terrorist landscape and lays out the administration's plan for defeating our terrorist adversaries. The strategy sets forth a comprehensive, whole-of-government approach that relies not just on military tools, but on civilian tools as well. In addition, we're not focusing on one or two particular terrorist groups, but on the full spectrum of terrorist organizations that could threaten our interests. In the same way, we're not focusing on particular geographic regions. Instead, our strategy sets forth foundational principles and priorities that we will pursue globally. The strategy renews our commitment to defeating global terrorist organizations and networks like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. In addition, it's no secret, certainly not to this subcommittee, that Iran remains the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. Tehran spends nearly $1 billion a year to support its terrorist proxies, $1 billion a year. The regime has a truly global reach, and we must elevate our efforts to counter its destructive influence around the world. Our strategy is an America First strategy, but that does not mean America alone. Quite the contrary, in fact. Terrorism is a global threat, and all nations have a role to play in countering it. Our strategy specifically highlights the need to leverage existing counterterrorism partnerships and develop new ones, and to build our partners' capabilities. Our goal is for our partners to be able to confront the terrorist threats they face independently without needing to routinely turn to the United States for assistance. Let me quickly run through some of our most important efforts. First, countering Iran and its terrorist proxies is a top priority for the Trump administration. We're using all of our tools to counter these deadly threats. We're pressing for greater international action against Hezbollah and delivering this message to our diplomatic partners at high levels. We're also helping our partners develop the capabilities they need to uncover and dismantle Iran's networks. So far this year, the administration has announced over 120 designation actions against Iran-backed entities and individuals under our counterterrorism authorities, 120. Just yesterday, the State Department announced 2 new Iran-related designations. We sanctioned Jawad Nasrallah, a rising Hezbollah figure and the son of Hassan Nasrallah, the group's Secretary General. We also designated the Al-Mujahideen Brigades, a terrorist group that has operated in the Palestinian territories since 2005 and whose members have plotted a number of attacks against Israeli targets. These State Department actions are in addition to the Treasury Department actions that you have already mentioned. Second, the administration is focused on cutting off the flow of money to terrorism. We don't just want to stop the bomber, we want to stop the money man who pays for the bomb. So far this year, my Bureau has announced 50 terrorist designation actions against groups and individuals under our foreign terrorist organization authorities, as well as under Executive Order 13224. We're also building the capacity of our partners to investigate, prosecute, and interdict funding to and facilitators of terrorism. Third, we're working to disrupt terrorist travel. We're leading the charge on greater information sharing and promoting effective screening and watch listing around the world. These efforts received a powerful boost last December when the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 2396, which includes a number of new tools that will be mandatory for the international community to adopt, including the use of passenger name record data, or PNR. In short, the resolution takes a number of critical counterterrorism measures that the United States pioneered after 9/11 and makes them global standards. Fourth, we're addressing the threats from foreign terrorist fighters and homegrown terrorists. Although foreign terrorist fighters are no longer streaming into the war zone in large numbers, we are focusing on them leaving the war zone, returning to their home countries or third countries. I see that my time has expired. The last thing I will say is that we're focusing on prevention and keeping the next generation of terrorists from emerging in the first place. And this is why our efforts to combat terrorist ideology and to combat recruitment are so critical. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, and all the members of the subcommittee, the terrorist threat is constantly evolving, and it's incumbent upon us as a government and with our allies to adapt along with that threat. My Bureau and I greatly appreciate Congress's efforts and support in this shared endeavor. I look forward to your questions and our conversation.
I recognize myself for some questions. Thank you again, Ambassador Sales, for being here. You said the Iranian government spends $1 billion a year on their Iranian proxies. Is that what you said?
That's right.
And we spend about, what, $230 million a year for your Bureau. Is that right?
That was the request for fiscal year 19, sir.
How much do we spend?
The numbers have fluctuated In recent years, it's been 222, 235,
All right,
400.
It's a quarter of what the Iranians spend on causing terror throughout the world, and we're spending a quarter of that trying to go after their proxies through your agency. That's the point I was trying to make. We have no CT bureau in South America, is that correct?
Well, my bureau is actively involved with South American partners, sir.
What does that mean?
It means that we're trying to get the governments of South America to work with us to confront the full range of terrorist threats.
So we want them to do it. We're trying to get them to do it.
We're trying to get them to do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
But we're not actively involved. We're working through other countries, like maybe Colombia.
Well, Congressman, we are actively involved, but our goal is to enable South American partners to do it themselves rather than turn to us for constant help.
I understand. How many proxies do the Iranians have working?
Dozens. Hezbollah is the best known.
You know, I'm not looking for a number. I know Hezbollah is the bad guy in the neighborhood, but how many proxies do they have throughout the world? Do they have a number?
I don't think there's a definitive number, but we can go through the list, and it's a very undistinguished list of bloodshed. Groups like Hezbollah, groups like Han and AAH that you mentioned, the Al-Ashtar brigades in Bahrain, various other militia groups in Iraq, throughout the region and around the world. They are not shy about using proxies to commit terrorism around the world.
So rather than use the IRGC, which is a terrorist group, they just use another proxy, and that way they can deny culpability because this proxy is doing their bidding.
Yes, sir.
Is that a fair statement?
In some cases, they do that, sir. Sometimes they act directly, and sometimes through proxies and cutouts.
Okay. Why hasn't the State Department, why hasn't the government, our government, designated AAH and HHN as terrorist proxies of Iran?
Well, so we're certainly concerned about the violent activities that those groups are carrying out. As you well know, Iranian-backed militias in Iraq, speaking generally now, have launched rockets at our embassy in Baghdad, launched rockets at our consulate in Basra, and the threat environment has gotten to the point where we judged it necessary to suspend operations at Basra consulate.
Specifically, Ambassador, why haven't we designated those two Iranian proxies as terrorist groups?
Well, sir, I don't have anything to announce for you today, but I can assure you that we're looking at the full range of terrorist proxies backed by Iran and the way to take appropriate action against them.
It seems to me that the embassy in Baghdad is pushing against designating these two organizations as terrorist proxies. This summer, we had part of this staff go to Baghdad and ask that they support designating these two groups as terrorist organizations, and they got pushback from the State Department, said that that's not going to happen, and then shortly thereafter, the 4 rockets came into Baghdad from AAH. I'm asking you to speculate here, but do you know why the State Department in Baghdad is obstinate about naming these two proxies, who now have 15 seats in the Iraqi government, as terrorist groups?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm reluctant to put words in the mouth of my colleagues in Baghdad, but I think that the rocket attacks in Baghdad and the rocket attacks in Basra in recent weeks and months have had a clarifying effect on our awareness of the threat that Iran poses to the region and to our forces.
It seems to me that we're fighting an uphill battle when we have 15 members of these proxy groups in the government of Iraq, and we're not calling them out for being terrorists with American blood on their hands. So I would just hope that we would, our government, the United States government, would designate these two organizations as terrorist groups, proxies of Iran. And I agree with what you said about Iran. They're everywhere. They're all over the world, and they're causing terror. And they have shifted, as the ranking member has said, they have shifted their focus from maybe the Middle East and Syria to Africa. About 9/11, pre-9/11, there were apparently about 100 al-Qaeda members in Africa, and now there are about 10,000 affiliates and al-Qaeda members in Africa. That's very disturbing. They're just moving, it's like moving from different place to different place. And Iran is behind all of this, and we need to make sure that Iran is held accountable, and the other organizations are held accountable as well. Do you have enough money?
Well, Congressman, what I want is every dollar that I need to accomplish the mission that the President and the Congress have given me, and not a dollar more.
Very, very diplomatic of you. I'm going to turn over to the ranking member and let him ask questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I agree with both my colleagues here on Iran as a grave concern, but I want to move around some other areas. You know, what I'm hearing in my district from people in terms of a question and a concern and maybe a fear is this. I want to ask you straight out. Is there any reliable evidence that individuals traveling in the caravan from Central America up are known or suspected terrorists?
Well,
concrete evidence.
Mr. Ranking Member, any country has the right and indeed the responsibility to protect its borders and to make sure that only those persons are admitted who the government of that country.
That's not what I asked you, sir. I asked you straight out. We should know, as members of Congress, tell us if there are any suspected or actual terrorists traveling in that caravan.
Congressman, we'd be happy to get you an answer to that question in an appropriate setting.
Well, you could answer this publicly. Since the President has been public, you should be able to be public. Yes or no? We don't have to know the details. He's causing fear in the American public, I can tell you, even in my district, about this. Now, a yes or a no is not classified because he said so. So I want to know, in your position, what you say, yes or no. You can give us in classified additional specific information, should there be any, but yes or no.
Senator, I'd be happy to answer that question as well in a classified setting.
Well, I'm not happy with that answer since the Commander-in-Chief seems comfortable telling the American public that, and you don't. Can't force you to do it, but I think that's why you're here, and that's why we're here as members of Congress as well. Let me shift gears then, disappointingly. I want to know what activity you have on the counterterrorism front and efforts in Afghanistan and Yemen, as I mentioned, and also include on that, directly or indirectly, through arms sales or other means, how Russia could be involved in this and what evidence you have in that respect.
Let me start with Afghanistan, sir. So in Afghanistan, my bureau, along with others at the State Department, is funding a $54 million program to boost the capability of Afghan forces to defend urban areas. In recent months, we've seen the Taliban and the Haqqani network mount an aggressive series of attacks in urban areas, particularly in Kabul. So what we've been doing is providing training and resources and equipment to local officials to help them interdict operatives before they come into protected areas, to respond to crises in the heat of the moment, to do effective screening of potential threats, and to respond after a terrorist incident takes place. In Yemen, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has long been one of Al-Qaeda's most deadly affiliates, with a global reach and with global ambitions. Of course, you'll recall the printer cartridge plot from several years ago that was run out of Yemen. We continue to be actively engaged using whole-of-government approaches, not just kinetic, but also non-kinetic civilian sector tools as well. In Yemen, we're doing things like boosting border security capabilities so that we can control movements of potential terrorists across borders, law enforcement and investigative capability, crisis response capability, and so on.
Could you didn't answer my question about Russia.
Oh yes, what was the question about Russia?
Russia's involvement directly or indirectly through arms sales or other activities on terrorist activity in Afghanistan, for instance? Or
In Afghanistan.
regions, or I mentioned, yes.
Yeah, in Afghanistan and Yemen, yes. Russia obviously has had a long historical interest in Afghanistan, not all of that interest benign. I think the best way to answer that question would be, and this may not be a pleasing answer to you either, but I'd be happy to answer in more detail in a classified setting.
All right, thank you for that. Now, in terms of your activity, how are you progressing with online activities, online terrorist activities?
Yeah, well, ISIS and its use of social media really has been a game changer in terms of their ability to inspire attacks remotely, as well as to recruit and radicalize people to come to the war zone. So what we need is for social media companies to do the responsible thing and take down radicalizing and extremist content that violates U.S. law or that violates the terms of service that they offer to their users. We've seen some decent results, but I think there's still more work to be done. Last year, a group of Silicon Valley companies formed a new organization, GIFCT, the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism. The basic idea is for incumbent and prosperous companies to provide best practices to new entrants who may not have the resources, who may not have the expertise, and help them spot content and take it down in a responsible way.
Okay, just I'm a little over, but I'd like just to get back to the budget issue as well. You know, the chairman has mentioned the disproportionate nature with what Iran is spending and what we're spending, and we've just touched it's just some of the many areas around the globe where there's concerns on the part of our country. How do you make that make any kind of sense to a budget cut in this important area? I mean, why is the budget being cut in an area where two things, where the dangers are great and where our actions, particularly in stateside, could save us money in the long run and save lives?
Well, Congressman, I think I'd offer two answers to that question. First of all, taking the historical view, our fiscal year 19 budget request is broadly in alignment with historical appropriations levels. Looking at my chart here, in 2013, we were appropriated $251 million. In 2014, it was $222. In 2015, it was $235. We saw a spike in 16 and 17 as we saw one-time, or rather two-time appropriations. The 237 number that we've requested for fiscal year 19 thus represents a return to the pre-2016 norm. That said, of course, Congress has the power of the purse, and whatever money Congress appropriates, we will expend towards the mission that the Congress and the President have given my Bureau. The second thing I'd say about funding to counter Iran in particular is, although our budget request is for $237 million, which is a fraction of the $1 billion that Iran spends on terrorist proxies, we're not the only bureau, we're not the only agency charged with countering Iran-backed terrorism around the world. Other State Department bureaus, the intelligence community, the Defense Department, the Justice Department, the Treasury Department are all team players as part of this effort.
My time is overdue, so I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, the Counterterrorism Bureau's Countering Violent Extremism Office shares and overlaps in many ways the responsibilities with the Global Engagement Center. This summer, Congress, as part of the National Defense Authorization Act, passed a provision that I helped author to clarify the roles and the responsibilities of the GEC. How has that clarification changed the way that the CVE office and the GEC cooperate and work alongside one another?
Well, thanks for the question, Congressman. My Bureau's involvement in CVE issues, we're one cook in the kitchen with several other Michelin-starred chefs. So it's important for us to all coordinate together and for each player to bring to bear their unique comparative advantage. Like, what do we bring to this conversation that is special to us? And I think the value add that my Bureau brings to this effort is a focus on a couple of different priority areas. First of all, countering ideology. Our terrorist adversaries have a particular worldview that is informed by various philosophical, religious, economic circumstances. What can we do, my Bureau asks, to counter the ideological architecture that eventually leads to radicalization and recruitment and terrorist attacks? Another thing that we're doing in my Bureau is working on de-radicalization. after somebody has gone down the pathway towards terrorism, what can we do after they've been prosecuted, after they've served their time, to bring them back into the fold? And in part, this is a matter for government authorities, but it's also a problem that to which we have to bring to bear all of society's expertise, medical professionals.
I don't mean to.
I don't want to filibuster. So
right.
Yes.
So I've got limited time. So thank you. I appreciate that. Shifting gears a bit here, compared to a year ago, what's your sense? Can you describe Iran's comparative strategic position in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen? Are they stronger? Are they weaker? What's different today than a year ago?
Well, I think what's different today is that the U.S. government has brought to bear more of the tools at our disposal to cut off the money that Iran uses to fund terrorism around the world. As you know, we announced the snapback of sanctions just last week, and our goal is to get Iranian oil exports down to zero. That's a significant economic windfall for the regime. I believe 80% of their revenues derive from their energy exports. As we squeeze them, they're going to have to make some really hard choices about how they divert their increasingly scarce resources to address domestic needs or to project power and bloodshed around the world.
What, if any, actions have you seen that would give you confidence that they are drawing back and cutting resources for Hezbollah, their proxies in Syria, other places?
Well, I think the jury is still out on that because we're very early into our maximum pressure campaign. What we want to see is with a drawdown in forces in Syria, a drawdown in support to the Houthis who are launching missiles into Saudi Arabia and UAVs into the United Arab Emirates, a drying up of the financial resources that Hezbollah seeds from all around the world. There's a robust fundraising network for them in South America, in Africa, and around the world. So we're attacking all of those different nodes of the Iran threat network to dry up the resources.
But the snapback of sanctions last week was long anticipated. Have you seen actions within Iran signaling to their proxies they're going to have to make do with less, or has there been a continued investment in those organizations like Hezbollah to continue their nefarious activities?
Well, what we've seen publicly is a rush for the exits in the private sector. Businesses...
That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, has the leadership in Iran done anything that would indicate that they're going to cut their investment in these activities? The $1 billion you talked about, is there anything that's signaling that they're going to reduce that $1 billion, or is it still going to be running at the current rate?
What I can tell you in an open and unclassified setting is that we are seeing businesses respond to the pressure that we are bringing to bear. Companies are being forced to choose, do I want to do business in the United States or in Tehran? And they're voting with their feet.
Right, and I see that. Last question, this is more general. Across the globe, looking forward, do you see the terrorist threats we face as a nation that challenge our allies around the globe increasing or decreasing in the years to come?
I think they are decreasing in certain respects and changing in other respects. The decrease, let's use ISIS as an example. We've liberated virtually all the territory they once held in their false caliphate of Syria and Iraq. And let me just say that at least 50% of those territorial gains have come since January of 2017. We're in better shape on the battlefield. Where we still have work to do is with ISIS-inspired attacks around the world, people who've never traveled to the battlefield, but who have been radicalized by videos they saw on the internet. All it takes is a rental truck, and they can commit a terrorist act.
And to that point, ISIS has lost its territory. It hasn't lost its intent. And without territory, there's things it cannot do. But with the internet, with other resources, they're able to reach and threaten not just America and Americans around the world, but our allies. Should we be reducing our investment to counter them, or is this something we need to be looking towards increasing our investment, looking for leverage with allies and making sure that we bring to bear, as you've said, the full government, all-of-government approach to address the threat, not just of ISIS, but of a number of these groups that seem to be growing in their ability to wreak havoc around the world?
Well, I think that's exactly right, Congressman. That's where the whole-of-government approach comes in, because as the military phase of the campaign draws down, it's important for us to bring to bear other tools. So law enforcement, prosecuting ISIS fighters after they return home, making sure they face justice for their crimes, border security tools so that we can track them as they attempt attempt to move internationally, designations and sanctions tools to cut off the flow of money to the various ISIS affiliates that have metastasized around the world, and various other civilian sector tools.
But I may have heard you wrong, and I'm way over, so I'll close on this. But you indicated that we plussed up in 2015, 2016 because of ISIS. Now we're going back down to levels of spending pre-ISIS, and it seems to me that we may be counting our chickens a little bit too early. We need to be thinking of different ways to counter this threat, but not resting on our heels and going back to the way things were, but looking forward to where we need to be in the future.
Well, the only thing, Congressman, if I may, before we leave this topic, the only other thing I would add to that conversation is if I felt like I didn't have the resources to do my job properly, I would tell my boss, I would tell Congress. So I'm satisfied with the resources we've requested, and will expend whatever resources I'm allocated.
Well, and in the future, look forward to continuing the conversation to see what impact we're having and hopefully have measurable results to
Likewise.
Show your ease. Thank you.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. I have a few more questions. Going back to this list of proxies that I asked for earlier, I mentioned, can you provide the committee a list of the Iranian proxies and where they are in the world?
Yeah, we're happy to do that, sir.
Okay. We look forward to seeing that. Also, do you think that AAH and HHN should be designated as terrorist organizations?
Well, Congressman, I'm reluctant to speak publicly about a
Excuse
matter
me for interrupting, but I'm going to pull a Keating on you. Can you answer yes or no, whether you think they should be listed or not?
I can't answer that, sir. But let me respectfully explain why I can't answer that question. I'm not in a position to comment on internal executive branch deliberations that may or may not be taking place. If there is an announcement, we will make it in due course. If there's not an announcement, we would do that in due course as well.
Well, I think they should be listed. I think we're having some problems with our representation of the U.S. in Baghdad, though, and how they cozy up to Iranian proxies. I'm very concerned about Iran influence in Iraq and trying to control the Iraqi government. I think that's what they're trying to do, and part of the way they're doing it is with Iranian proxies that are in Iraq. Like I said, they've already got 15 members of their parliament holding office, and we need to push back on their influence in Iraq. Afghanistan, we've been in Afghanistan a long time. How long are we going to stay in Afghanistan?
As long as conditions warrant.
Indefinitely might be a fair answer. Would you say that?
Well, my understanding of the President's South Asia strategy is that our policy for Afghanistan is one that is conditions-based. We're not going to set an arbitrary deadline because that will just cause the terrorists to wait us out. Rather, we want a conditions-based approach under which the Afghan government participates in a negotiated settlement with the Taliban, with other interested parties in the region to ensure that we have a strong unity government that can deny safe haven. From a counterterrorism standpoint, that's really a critical piece of the conversation. We cannot afford to go back to a pre-2001 environment in Afghanistan or elsewhere where terrorists enjoy safe haven. Because when terrorists enjoy safe haven, they project power outward and attack us and our friends.
I'm not asking you to give us a definite date. I'm not even saying that. But on the horizon, it looks like to me, as General Miller indicated to the Senate in June, that we're going to be there for a long time in Afghanistan because of the situation with the terrorists that are in that country. And Afghanistan has got to work their problems out. Are terrorists still coming from Pakistan into Afghanistan?
Well, Pakistan certainly needs to do more to...
Are they still coming from Pakistan into Afghanistan, terrorists?
We are very concerned about support for terrorism by in any region of the world. And I can tell you, we have communicated to the Pakistani government at the highest levels that we expect them to do more, just like we expected them to act with us after 9/11. And Pakistan has in the past been a very effective counterpart in taking the fight to al-Qaeda. We need them to do the same thing with respect to the Haqqanis, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and the other terrorist groups that are active in the region.
Well, I think they're not doing their job to fight terrorism, because the terrorists come in from Pakistan into Afghanistan, do their mischief, and run back across the border. I think they've been doing that for years. And they take our money, millions of dollars we give Pakistan every year. It befuddles me why we do that when they don't, when they allow a safe haven for terrorists in their own country that invade another country, namely Afghanistan. I will yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts for further questioning.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I share those concerns as well. And try this again, and just to not put you in a spot where it's classified. Now, getting back to the caravan and the President's comments. He said, in terms of the terrorists, there could very well be, it's a quote-unquote, among the group. And he said, I think there's a very good chance you have people in there. Now, given what you know, if there are no people in there that you have evidence of, then how could it be classified? So let me just ask you the question. Will you say, no, there are no people in there?
I'm not trying to be coy, Congressman, but let me tell you, I used to be a law professor, and one of the subjects I taught was the Espionage Act. And I know very well the criminal penalties associated with public release, unauthorized public release of any classified information. So I'm going to have to defer that question, but I would be happy. I want to be responsive to your question. I want to get you the information you're asking for. I just want to do it in the right setting.
Good. Well, I welcome that information, and I hope there is information, because I don't want to waste the committee's time or my time to find out there's no information there or there's nothing that can be done. So I just want to make sure that that's the case. Sorry. Okay, I think that's it for my time, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate this, and I'll look forward to that, what I assume will be information. Thank you. Yield back.
Well, I want to ask another question.
Thank you. Go ahead. Might as well. Huh?
Are there Iranian proxies working with the Iraqi police?
With the Iraqi who?
The Iraqi police.
Oh, police. With the Iraqi police.
The Iraqi police, the Iranian proxies, are they working to, some of them have infiltrated the Iraqi police?
I'd be happy to discuss that in a closed session.
In a closed session. Yeah. We're going to have a long closed session.
I couldn't, yeah.
We will take you up on that.
You know where to find me, Congressman. Always happy to appear before the subcommittee.
Well, we appreciate that, and we look forward to talking to you again in a classified setting. But last thing, I do want to reiterate, we'd like the list of those Iranian proxies and where they are. I will echo what the ranking member said about the money. The Iranians are spending at least $1 billion on causing terror in the world. I think they're spending more than that, but they admit to $1 billion, and we're spending a quarter of that trying to fight their actions. And I think we're in for a long duration of Iranian terrorist activities throughout the world. After all, they are the #1 state sponsor of terror in the world. Did you want to say something else? Of course.
Mr. Chairman, one more question. Thank you, Ambassador. Can you describe how the Bureau for Counterterrorism is addressing the women's role in preventing counterterrorism activities? Specifically, how are you promoting the meaningful participation of women as full partners? For example, are you working to increase the number of women receiving training under the Anti-Terrorism Assistance Program? This is something that the full committee's chair, Mr. Royce, and I have been working on as well as Representative Frankel from Florida on this issue, and they're not here, and if you could comment on that, that would be appreciated.
I'd be happy to, Congressman. Before I answer that question, let me briefly react to Chairman Poe's question about the $1 billion versus the $237 million. It's true, Iran is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. It's a title that they are probably very proud of. And it's not one they're looking to relinquish anytime soon. We are spending $237 billion. We've requested $237 million for the CT Bureau, but the entirety of the U.S. government's efforts to counter Iran-backed terrorism is much more extensive than just the $237 million we've requested from my bureau. So I would like to contextualize our request in the context of the broader USG effort against Iran-backed terrorism. As for the question of women, this is a very important issue, Congressman, and I'm grateful to you and your colleagues for raising it. It's one we need to focus on very carefully. Women are both potential victims of terrorism in unique ways, and women are also potential perpetrators of terrorism in unique ways. And they're also potential detectors of terrorism in unique ways. Let me address that last piece first. One of the things that my bureau has done has been to work with civil society organizations around the world to help families do a better job of detecting the warning signs of radicalism. It often will be the case that parents, it often will be the case that mothers are in a position to know when their children are taking a turn towards extremism. So we need to empower those communities, we need to empower those families to intervene immediately to prevent somebody from taking the next step down the road. It's also the case that women can be victims of terrorism. We're all aware of the horrific crimes that ISIS committed against women in Iraq and Syria. And so it's important for our counterterrorism response to ISIS or to other terrorist groups that commit similar atrocities, be mindful of what those atrocities are so that we can prevent them the next time, so that we can empower communities to prevent those, empower governments to prevent those sorts of crimes.
The chair is going to recognize the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you and the ranking member for having this committee. Committee hearing, and Ambassador, you're for being here. I just want to ask you about the refugee crisis. We're in the midst of the world's worst refugee crisis, and yet the administration just recently announced that they were going to lower the already record low number that we were accepting from 45,000 to 30,000. Meantime, you've got the Syrian refugees, the Yemen, Rohingya, some are coming across our southern border, or coming to our southern border. The president wants to choke off admission, limit asylum, and also cut foreign assistance. I'm wondering how you feel about the refugee situation, and as it worsens, doesn't that increase threats of terrorism? And do you think these issues are getting enough attention or enough resources so that you can do your job?
Well, we're certainly worried about the various refugee flows and their relation to terrorism threats. This is not a mere hypothetical. This is a problem that we have seen materialize in real-world terms. The Syrian crisis has precipitated an enormous outflow of migrants from Iraq and Syria through Turkey, through the Balkans and other parts of Europe into the heart of Western Europe. And it's regrettable to say, but true to say, that ISIS was able to exploit those migrant flows to bring operatives into the heart of Europe. Just yesterday was actually the 3-year anniversary of the Bataclan attack in Paris. So I think it's incumbent upon us to do a couple of things to address this problem. First of all, we need to get control of borders. We need to know if terrorists, financiers, terrorist operatives are trying to infiltrate our homelands, whether it's here in the United States or in Europe. And we also need, in the case of Syria in particular, a negotiated political settlement that alleviates the humanitarian crisis that is causing so many of these people to flee in the hope of a better life, or for terrorists to exploit that hope to accompany them.
Don't you think that it's moving in the opposite direction to cut off aid to the countries that are producing these refugees at a time like we've seen threaten to cut off aid to Central American countries? Don't we need to address the problem before it gets to our border?
Well, certainly the best form of protection is prevention. And when it comes to terrorism, the refugee problems that my bureau is focused on most intently involve Syria, which we've already discussed. Also, the problem in Southeast Asia, problem is putting it mildly, with the atrocities being committed against the Rohingya. We're watching that very carefully as well to ensure that terrorists are never able to exploit those tragedies and those atrocities to radicalize and recruit.
Are you looking at terrorism in terms of some of the rise of groups that are on the far right, like the neo-Nazis or the nationalists? What about those kinds of terrorism groups that we're seeing an increase of, not only in this country, but it's certainly in Europe?
Right. Well, we're certainly, the administration is certainly watching that threat, and it's one that's a very troubling threat. The recent attack in Pittsburgh is a particularly heart-rending example of this domestic threat. When it comes to the domestic aspects of this threat, this is an issue that my Bureau doesn't really focus on, as our jurisdiction is to look overseas. But I can assure you that colleagues at Homeland Security and Justice and the FBI are focused very intently on that problem, along with state and local officials.
But it's increasing in Europe, too, and that is part of your domain. I wonder if when you're talking to people about addressing this issue, does it ever come up about some of the president or the administration's rhetoric as encouraging this kind of behavior?
Well, I can tell you that the administration's position on this is clear. It's in our national CT strategy, and this national counterterrorism strategy describes far right, far left, secular, and various other forms of radicalism and extremism that produce violence, and we condemn it and lay out a strategy to confront it.
I guess the national strategy for counterterrorism that was released last month, though, mentioned Islamic terrorists 22 times, but the neo-Nazi groups only twice, and racially motivated extremism once. So I just wonder how much of a priority you are making those kinds of terrorists.
Well, again, I'll defer to the FBI and DOJ and DHS, but without presuming to speak for them, those references are in the National Counterterrorism Strategy for a reason, and it's because countering those far right as well as far left groups and groups in between of violent nature is a priority for this administration.
I hope so. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York. Yields back his time. Ambassador Sales, thank you for being here. We are going to take you up on your willingness to talk to us in a classified setting. And just so it's clear, the three issues that we want to talk about are terrorists, if any, in the caravan that is moving toward the United States. We want to talk about that. And we want to talk about the extent of the Russian involvement in Yemen and also in Afghanistan. And we want to talk about the third issue is the Iranian proxies that are in the Iraqi police forces. Those are the three issues we, as soon as we can, do this.
Great. We'll be ready, sir.
Appreciate it, Ambassador Sales. Thank all the members for being here today. And this subcommittee is adjourned.
No one's looking at it.